ChatGPT's powerful new updates like the Assistance API provide amazing features like knowledge retrieval from documents. But can this new feature be used to build systems like customer support systems or websites like Amazon? In this video, we'll write some code and we will build our own assistant. And to this assistant, we will give a PDF copy of a product page of Amazon. And then we'll ask questions to it. And let's see if our assistant is able to answer it or not. And in the process, we will understand what is actually an assistant and how to build one using the Assistance API. We will understand what are threads, what are messages, and what actually it means to run a thread. So let's start. If you are new to this channel, my name is Mohammed Shahrukh, and I make videos on coding and AI and how you can build amazing things using it. So in the last video, we created assistants on the OpenAI's website, and we also touched upon what are assistants, what are threads, and what are messages. But this time we will create assistants using the OpenAI's Assistance API. Okay, so the application which we'll be building will have a front end and it'll have a back end. For the front end, we won't be writing any code in this video because we'll be taking the same code that we have covered in this video, where we have created a custom UI for ChatGPT. And for the backend, we'll be starting off with a utils function where we'll be writing all the utility functions that our API will be using. And for the API, we'll be using Fast API. So fire up a text editor of your choice. I will be using VS Code over here. And let's start by creating a virtual environment. So using this command, we can create one. I will then activate it, env/bin/activate. And after that, let's create a file. I will call it utils.py. Okay, so the first library which we'll be installing is, of course, OpenAI. So pip install OpenAI. Now, once it is done installing, we will import it like this from OpenAI, import OpenAI. And then we will create a client of OpenAI. So for this line of code to work, you need to have your OpenAI API key in your environment variables. So let's create our env file for this, .env. And over here, we'll be pasting our OpenAI API's keys. So bin/bash export OpenAI API key equals to the value of the API key. Now, after saving this file, you should run source.env. Now, at the heart of our application is an assistant. So the first thing which we'll be creating in our app is an assistant. So let me write a function for that. So def create assistant. And remember, the assistant's API is still in beta. So we will use client.beta.assistants.create. Now this function call will want some parameters, and first of them being the name that we want to give our assistant. So I will call it Amazon customer support because that is what we will be doing with this assistant. And after that, we need to supply the instructions. So instructions, as I said before, is a line that tells the assistant for what purpose this would be used for. And over here, I'll type in, you are a customer support agent. Your job is to answer customer queries. Take information from the uploaded files. Next thing which we need to specify is a model that this assistant would be using. And for this example, we will be using GPT-4 1106 -preview. Now, a thing to note over here is that not all models currently support the retrieval tool that we will be using. After specifying the model, we need to specify the tools that this assistant would be using. And tools is basically an array. So in this, you need to specify the type as retrieval. So this is the tool that we are enabling for our assistant. Now, next is the files parameter, file IDs parameter that we need to specify. Now, the way it works is that, let's say you have a file in PDF or text format, and you want to do knowledge retrieval based on the information in the file. then first of all, you will have to kind of upload the file, and you'll be doing it via the files API by OpenAI, and then you will get a file ID back. So you'll be using the file ID over here. So for this, we will be needing a file ID. So let's say the file ID is this. So now let's write a function that would basically create our file object and give us the file ID. So we'll call it def create file, and it will be file equals client dot files dot create, and it will expect two parameters, one of them being the file itself, like which file we want to upload. So for this, we'll be using open, let's name our file as knowledge.pdf, and we will be opening it as read bytes. The next parameter is purpose. Purpose basically tells for what purpose this file is being uploaded. So the purpose is, of course, to create an assistant, and we will just return file.id. A thing to note over here is that we need to persist this file ID, because every time we create a new assistant from this file, we need this file ID. So it is better to persist it. So to persist it, we can use some sort of database, but to keep it simple, I will be using file storage, and I'll be simply storing the file IDs as a JSON in a JSON file. So let me write a few helper functions for that. The first helper function which we'll be writing is the save data. We'll call it save data, and it will be receiving a key value pair, and it will basically write this key value pair to our JSON file. Let's declare a data variable like this, and after that, let's open our data file with open data.json data file, and after that we will do data equals json.load data file, and we need to import JSON as well. We need to add the new key value pair, so data key equals value, and then we need to write this data back to our file. So we'll open the file again with open data.json, and this time we want to write to our file, and as data file we will do json.dump. We will be dumping the data to our data file. Yeah, and this completes our save data function. Now let's write another helper function that will give us this data from the file. So we'll call it def get data, and we will do with open data.json, and we will open it in the read mode, and as data file we will return json.load data file. So this will give the JSON data from our JSON file. Okay, so before we proceed with anything, let's test these two functions out, and let me just comment this function for now. Let's call our save data function. We will call it like this, name equals test, and let me create a new file so that it doesn't throw an error. I will call it data.json, and I will paste an empty dictionary over here. And after that, let me just run python utils.py file, and hopefully it should work. And there we have it. The data should be there in the JSON file, and it's working fine. So let's proceed with our code. So the thing which we need to do is to persist this file ID. We will call save data. We'll call it file ID as key, and the value should be file.id. Okay, so to run this function, we need this knowledge.pdf file. So let me quickly grab this file. So here is the knowledge file, knowledge.pdf. If you see the contents, it's basically a product detail page from Amazon converted to a PDF format. Let's just quickly test this function. So we will call, let me again comment this function out so that it doesn't throw any error. So we'll call create file, and we will also print the output. Let's print the output. Let's see what is the file ID that we are getting. And also we will be going to our assistants on the website of OpenAI and see if a file is created over here or not. So now let me run the file. So python utils.py file, And remember to set the OpenAI API key in the environment variable, otherwise this won't work. So there I have it. A file is created, and let's go to our UI and refresh it, and there you should see a file is being uploaded. It's uploaded already. So let's start to work on our assistant again. So let's say we'll be getting the file ID from another function called get file ID. And the reason I'm writing it as a separate function rather than getting it directly from the file is that just to handle a case where the file is not created. So let me just write that function real quick. Def get file ID, and the first thing it will do is that it'll get the data. So data equals get data, and then it will check if the file ID is there in the data or not. So if data dot get file ID, if it is there, then you just return the file ID, this thing. Otherwise you return create file, and as you can see that create file already returns the file ID, and it will also save to our JSON file. So now once this is done, so we are calling it over here and we are creating the assistant over here. We also need to persist the assistant ID. Okay, so the way it will work is that every time our application is called, it's executed, our assistant will be called and the assistant will be asked questions. So we need to persist this assistant ID as well. So let's do it in the next line. So save data assistant ID assistant dot ID. Okay, so so the next thing which we should do is of course test this create assistant function, and we will call it over here create assistant, and let's see if it works. Python utils.py. Okay, so it looks like the function executed, and let's go back to our UI and go to the assistants, and over here you can see that there is an assistant that is created. So we have successfully created our assistant. So now let's move to the next part where we will be creating a thread. So what is a thread? So a thread represents a conversation, and you can add as many messages as you want to your threads, and there's no limit to that. But the assistant makes sure that all the messages that you have added remains within the context window. And if let's say a message comes in and it exceeds the context size, then it uses some optimization techniques like truncation. So let's create a thread now. For that, I'll be writing a function called def create thread, and we will be doing thread, and we will be calling client.beta.threads.create. That's it. And we also need to persist the thread ID. So we will do save data thread ID thread.id and return thread ID. Okay, so now that our thread is created, we need to write another function that basically writes our messages to a particular thread. So we will call this function def add message to thread. So for this we will be needing the thread ID, and for getting the thread ID, again we will be writing a helper function get thread ID, and we also need the assistant ID. So assistant ID equals get assistant ID. So in a particular thread, an assistant will also be added because that assistant will be responding to our queries. So now let's write these two functions. So def get thread ID. So first of all, it will do get the data, get data. If data dot get thread ID, then return this thing. Otherwise, return create thread. As you can see, that create thread returns the thread ID, and we will be using an exact same code for the assistant as well. Get assistant ID, and let me just copy this code and paste it over here, and assistant ID. And then otherwise we'll be calling create assistant function, and create assistant should also return the assistant ID. So let me add it over here, return assistant.id. Okay, now that we have our thread ID and assistant ID, let's add this message that we receive in this function to our thread. So the message content will be received as a parameter over here. Next, we need to create a message object. So we will do message equals client dot beta dot threads dot message dot create, and this will expect a few parameters. So one of them being the content of the message. And for this, we have the message content, which will be coming as a parameter to this add message to thread function. And after that, we need to specify the thread ID. So thread ID will be equals to the thread ID. And the other parameter which we need is the role. So next we need to run our thread. So running basically means invoking our assistant and getting a response from the model that we have specified. So for that, we'll be creating a run. So we'll call it run equals client dot beta dot threads dot run dot create, and this run would again want some parameters, and one of them being the thread ID and other being the assistant ID. Okay, to understand it better, when you create a run, it will basically invoke the assistant and ask for a response, and all of this will happen in a thread. So that's why we have supplied the thread ID. Now once a run is created, it will have different statuses, and we need to check for the completed status. And once the status of the thread is completed, only then we can find the response in the messages. So before that, let's persist our run ID as well. So save data, run ID, run.id. Here's a quick recap of what we have done so far. To start off, we have written the two helper functions for reading and writing data to our data.json file, and we are using it as a database. Next, we have written a helper function for creating the file object. Now this basically uploads the knowledge.pdf file to OpenAI, which we can then use for knowledge retrieval. And we have also called the save data helper function in this create file function. Next, we have written the get file ID helper function, which basically gets the file ID from data.json. And if it is not there, it will call the create file function. So next, we have written the helper function for creating an assistant. And for creating an assistant, first of all, we have gotten the file ID. And after we have got the file ID, we have created an assistant calling the assistants API by OpenAI. And we have also saved the assistant's ID in our data.json file. Moving on, we have created a thread in this helper function create thread. And where we are just creating a thread and we are saving the thread ID to our data.json file. And next, we have written a helper function for getting the thread ID either from the data.json file or creating a new thread and then returning the ID via this function. And moving on, we have created another helper function for getting the assistant ID. And again, it's the same logic where it is trying to get the assistant ID from the data.json file, else it is creating a new assistant and returning the ID. And at last, we have written a function which basically adds a message to a thread. And we have provided the message content as a parameter to this function. Okay, so the next thing which we need to do is to find the status of a running thread. So for that, let's write a helper function again, and we'll name it get thread running status, or run status rather. So the first thing which we'll be doing is that we will be getting the thread ID. So thread ID we will be getting from the function get thread ID. After that, we need the run ID. So run ID should be there in the file. So when we are running the assistant over here, it is saving the run ID. So it's the same run ID we are trying to retrieve over here. So first of all, let's get the data. So data equals get data. And if not data.get run id, then we will return an error. So this is checking if the run id key is not there in our data, then we will have to throw an error because the run id is not there in our database. So we'll be basically returning a tuple of two items. So one will be success, whether it's success or not. So the success is false, and the other would be an error message, or simply a message, run not created. All right. Now we need to retrieve the run. So we will call run equals client dot beta dot thread dot runs dot retrieve, and over here we will be supplying the thread id equals the thread id, and run id would be the run id. It would be data dot get run id, right? Now once we have the run, we will return success as true, and we will then return the run dot status. So this is the helper function which we'll be using to get the status of the run. And once the status of the run is completed, that's when we have finally received our response, and that will be present in the message. So let's write a function for that as well. So I'll call it get last message in thread. And for this, we'll be needing the thread ID. So thread ID we will be getting from the get thread ID. And once we have the thread ID, we will need to call the list API or call of the thread. So we will call it messages equals client dot beta dot threads dot messages dot list, and the thread ID should be thread ID. And now we have all the messages. So the last message would be present in a particular index, which is the first index. So we will return messages, the 0th, and then content, the first content, and then the text dot value. So this is the contents of the last message, and this is what we'll be needing. So we have written a lot of functions, and trust me, there's just one last function that we need to write in this utils.py file. And this is the function which we'll be calling from our API layer. Okay, so we'll call it a def get response, and it will receive the query as a parameter. And the first thing which we'll be doing with this query is that we will be adding this query as a message to our thread. So we'll call add message to thread and query. We'll pass in the query. After that, we need to continuously check for the status of the run. So as you will see in this function that we have created a run and saved the run ID. Now for this run ID, we'll have to check the status continuously. So let's declare two variables called success and the other being run status. We'll initialize them as false and none. Now while not, I need the success as true, while success equals true, and run status equals completed. So we will run this while loop until this condition is met. So what we'll do is that we will again get success, and the run status equals get thread run status. All right, so we have the success and the run status. Now once the run status is completed, then we'll be exiting this loop, and once we have this thing, we can go ahead and get the last message. So we will just return get last message in thread. So also let's include a sleep over here, so time dot sleep, so that it checks after every, let's say, 3 seconds, and we will import time. And so it'll sleep for 3 seconds, and then it will retry and get the status of the thread. And if it is completed and the success is true, then we will be exiting from this while loop, and we will be getting the last message and returning it. This function finally gives us the response from the query that we send it. So there are just two parts that are left for building our application. The first being the backend, and the other being the API layer. So let's make two folders for that. I'll make backend and one for the front end. And I'll move all of these code to my backend folder. And I will also move the env to backend. And for the front end, we'll just copy the code from our previous video. I've just pasted the code from the previous video in the front end folder. So let's go to the folder and we will go to this folder. After that, let me just run npm install. Now, once it's done installing, I will run the server npm run start. And this is how the UI looks like. Now, if you're going through the front end code yourself, you should just have a look at this file. And this file contains all the logic. Okay, so let's come back to working on the backend. Let me create a new file. I will call it main.py. So let's import fast API. From fast API, import fast API. We will create a fast API app. After that, let's import our utility function that we wrote from utils, import get response. So now let's work on the handler function, and I will write app.get and the path will be /ask, and I will call my handler function ask questions, and it will receive a parameter of q. And the only thing which we'll be doing in our handler function will be calling our get response utility function. We will do response equals get response, and we will pass on the query that we have received, and then we will return the result. So the result will be response with a key of text. Now, apart from this, there is one more thing that we need to add to our application, and that is for adding the CORS headers. So let's do it now. From fastapi.middlewares.CORS, import CORS middleware, and then we will create an origins array. And in this origins array would be http localhost :3000, and then we will do app.add middleware, and then we will add the CORS middleware and a couple of configurations for that. The first will be allow origins. This would be origins, then allow credentials as true, allow methods, we will allow all methods, allow headers, and we will allow all headers. Now, before we can start our backend server, there is one more thing that we need to do. We'll just delete the previous virtual environment that we copied, and we'll create a fresh one. Now, after that, we'll just activate it, and then we will install all the dependencies in the new virtual environment. We will do pip install OpenAI, fast API, and unicorn standard. Now, once it is done installing, also make sure that the OpenAI API key is present, and then we will run unicorn like this. Unicorn main app reload, and this will start the development server. Okay, so I just realized there is one tiny fix that we need to do. So in the get last message in thread function, so messages will be calling the list API, but we need to also do the .data. So this will return the proper messages. Okay, so now we are done with the coding, and both the front end and the backend code is running. So now let's go to our UI and ask our customer support agents a few questions. In front of us, we have an Amazon customer support agent who can answer all the queries related to Apple MacBook Air M2. So let's ask, how much RAM does the system has? Let's send. Okay, so the agent answered correctly that it has 8 GBs of RAM. Now let's ask about the customer reviews of this product. Can you tell me about the customer reviews in short? Okay, so it gave me a sort of summary of the reviews of the laptop, and you can see that it has got 4.5 out of 5 stars. Okay, so now let's ask it one last question about the return policy. Can you tell me about the return policy for this product? Okay, so it has got information from the PDF, and somewhere it might be written that the Amazon does not accept returns for this laptop unless it's damaged. Okay, so there you have it. In this video, we built our very own customer support agent using the OpenAI's Assistance API. So can we build a fully functional customer support agent using the new Assistance API? And the answer is yes. Just like for this video, we gave it data for a single web page, we can give the data from multiple web pages to the Assistance API, and then it can answer questions based on the data. But of course, for more complex queries, we will need human intervention. So let me know in the comments below how you found building this little project along with me. A GitHub link of all the code that we wrote in this video will be there in the description, so do check it out. And if you would like to create assistants without coding on the OpenAI's website, you can check out my other video over here. Until then, happy coding and happy creating.